In the post-Civil War era, the American economy was undergoing a transformation, and with this period of unprecedented growth came a revolution in the way business was conducted in the U.S. from then on. As a result of industrialization, businesses were becoming more productive, and the rapidly expanding national transportation and communication system allowed for the emergence of new nationwide markets. For these reasons, big business was on the rise, and soon giant corporations existed in every major industry. Nevertheless, big businesses still saw obstacles to their economic dominance, and thus large companies began to consolidate under monopolistic combinations called trusts. These trusts coordinated the production and pricing of formerly competing firms with the goal of destroying competition and any limits to profitability. Although the trusts became more and more powerful, their merciless tactics such as pricing controls, production and distribution agreements, and exclusivity contracts not only eliminated competition, but also restrained new small businesses from entering the market, and resulted in higher costs and limited availabilities for consumers. Nevertheless, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, American people began to see that trusts were solely concerned with their own profits at the expense of the national economy. From this realization came public frustration with the industrialists. However, at that time, laissez-faire capitalism still prevailed as economic policy. Even as states tried to pass antitrust measures to rein in the monopolies, a pro-big business environment existed. Furthermore, because the states could not regulate interstate commerce, they could not tackle the biggest trust issues. Out of this situation came the popular idea that the federal government needed to take on a regulatory role, and from this sentiment emerged the antitrust movement, which would become a clear turning point in United States economic history, as it marked the American government's first intervention in the country's economic system, and defined the role of the federal government in regulating the national economy. As the movement rose in popularity, and came to see the captains of industry as so-called robber barons, great pressure was placed on the federal government to take action. In 1887, Congress took its first major step in support of the antitrust movement with the establishment of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which would regulate corporations and investigate those suspected of monopolistic activity. This first measure was a definitive turning point, from corporate giants setting their own rules to a federal agency having the power to monitor and investigate business practices. However, the greatest achievement of the movement would come 3 years later with the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Proposed by Republican Senator John Sherman of Ohio, the Sherman Act outlawed monopolization, unreasonable restraint of trade, and anti-competitive practices, giving the U.S. Attorney General the power to prosecute any trust in violation of these provisions in federal court. Like the ICC before it, the Sherman Act demonstrates how momentous of a turning point the antitrust movement was. Before, big business, unhindered by the government, could use whatever means necessary to turn the greatest profit. Now, however, large corporations not only were given rules to follow, but violating such regulations could mean their destruction. Although the vague language of the Sherman Act and a pro-business judiciary led to a slow start for the antitrust law, the 1901 election of the trust-busting President Theodore Roosevelt and his progressive followers would give new momentum to the movement, and with one major case, he would prove America's economy had indeed undergone a turning point. This case originated in the desire of 2 men in the railroad business to increase profits by driving competition out of the northern U.S. market, when J.P. Morgan and James Hill combined their competing parallel rail lines into the Northern Securities Holding Company. However, President Roosevelt could see no reason for the merger other than to restrain trade, so he ordered his Attorney General to file suit against Northern Securities. In court, the prosecutors argued that the holding company interfered with interstate commerce, while Morgan and Hill held that the government was violating their right to own property. Nevertheless, the case made it to the Supreme Court in 1904, and the justices ruled that Northern Securities had violated a constitutional Sherman Act, and the company was ordered to be dissolved. With this decision, it was proven that the antitrust movement has resulted in an economic turning point, and with this case as a starting point, progressives would continue to intervene in the affairs of large corporations, ensuring their compliance with anti-monopoly policies. After Roosevelt, the effects of the antitrust movement as a turning point were still very evident. For example, President William Taft's administration saw even more trust busting than that of his predecessor Roosevelt. And later, President Woodrow Wilson also sought to aid labor and the common consumer with further antitrust reforms. Under Wilson, a new, more powerful regulatory agency called the Federal Trade Commission came into existence to investigate big business and enforce antitrust laws prohibiting monopolistic practices. Also in 1914, Congress passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, clarifying the Sherman Act, and also closing its loopholes regarding labor and specific practices promoting the restraint of trade. Still, even after this progressive period, it was very clear that the antitrust movement had been a turning point in American economics, as the federal government continued to impose increasingly specific and stringent antitrust regulation, in sharp contrast to the pre-1890 economic climate. Throughout the 20th century, the federal government would continue to pass antitrust legislation and regulate big business, as can be seen with the Robinson-Patman Act and the Sellers-Kefauver Act, both of which banned specific monopolistic practices. Even in the 1990s and early 2000s, it is possible to see the effects of the antitrust movement, with federal lawsuits against corporations such as AT&T and Microsoft, accused of restraining competition. In these ways, it is very clear that the antitrust movement has had a significant and long-lasting impact on American economics. Furthermore, it was a definitive turning point, as the nation's economic policy and popular attitude shifted from laissez-faire capitalism and non-intervention to a strong desire to monitor, regulate, and punish large corporations utilizing unfair or restrictive business practices.